Hello, human geographers. We are here for our first lecture in our agriculture unit. So in our textbook, we're skipping chapter 9 for right now. We're going to come back to it, and we're going to talk about agriculture. So we're starting on chapter 10. Let's get started. First off, what is agriculture? It's one of our vocabulary terms for this chapter. And here's the definition. As always, we're going to underline important parts of the definition, but I would also encourage you, make sure that how are you going to remember this? If this were on a free response question, an FRQ, what association would you make with this word in order to remember that definition? So maybe it's a key word, maybe it's a mnemonic device, something like that. That's what you're going to write in your notes, trying to help you remember this. So agriculture, the deliberate effort to modify a portion of Earth's surface through the cultivation of crops and the raising of livestock for sustenance or economic gain. Now, there's a lot of important parts of that definition, so let's jump into it. First, it's the deliberate effort. This is a choice that is undertaken. It's not an accident, all right? And we're going to talk about maybe it started out as an accident. There's some debate about that. But this is now choice. And so agriculture influences the cultural landscape because choices are made by people in different areas. And so that influences the cultural landscape as a result. Obviously, we're modifying a portion of Earth's surface in a variety of different ways. We're going to get into all the different types of agriculture that we see throughout the world. We'll talk about the cultivation of crops here in just a minute. But it's not just plants. Okay? It's also livestock as well. So plants and animals, we're going to talk about that as far as the first agricultural revolution here in a minute. And then the two broad categories of agriculture are subsistence agriculture and commercial agriculture. And we see both referenced here in this definition. The part where it says for sustenance, meaning to sustain yourself, to survive, to feed yourself, okay, to feed your family. That's called subsistence agriculture. And then for economic gain, to sell it, that's commercial agriculture. Okay? Now, when we say to cultivate crops, what do we mean with that? When we say cultivate, we mean to care for. And that's important because these plants that we take care of are called crops. So any plant that we take care of or care for is a crop. All right, so that's what we mean when we say cultivation of crops. We're basically taking care of plants. We're looking after it. We're, all these different things, watering it, tending to it, all that kind of stuff, so that it grows up and produces food. That is what agriculture is. Now, there are a series of events that we have to talk about in the development of agriculture over time. So the first couple of lectures in this unit, we're going to be looking at this. Tonight we're going to be talking about hunters and gatherers and the first agricultural revolution, also known as the Neolithic Revolution. And then our next lecture, we're going to look at the second agricultural revolution, which coincided with the Industrial Revolution, and the third agricultural revolution, which took place during the 20th century, beginning, depending on who you talk to, during the 1930s with Norman Borlaug, and extending into, as it diffused out to different places, 1940s in Mexico, 1960s-ish in India. And generally, you're going to see another term used synonymously with the third agricultural revolution. And it's another one of our vocabulary terms. And that is the Green Revolution. So there's a really strong crossover between the third agricultural revolution and the Green Revolution. So a lot of times those two terms are used synonymously, used interchangeably. I'm sure someone that is much more nuanced, if you were to study agriculture in college, would actually say, well, actually those are two separate events and there's subtle differences there. But generally in this course, you're going to see them used interchangeably. So let us begin with hunters and gatherers. Okay, hunting and gathering was a practice that took place before agriculture. So before agriculture was happening, before we were taking care of plants and raising livestock and things like that, we were hunters and gatherers. And typically, those groups were very, very small. They had very low population density. They were nomadic, so there wasn't a lot of permanent settlements, and there wasn't a lot of material culture, because if you're nomadic, you have to carry everything with you. It's not like we can just load it up in the U-Haul and drive to the next spot, right? We can't do that. So we have to carry everything with us. Therefore, you're not going to have the same kind of material culture, because the more stuff you have, the more stuff you have to carry. And again, we haven't domesticated animals yet, so we can't load up a donkey or a horse or something like that and have it carry it. We have to carry it. So very small groups, low population density, couldn't sustain a large number of people. So most of the nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes that were studied in kind of ancient history, very, very small, because they couldn't sustain very large populations. All right. Typically, the hunting was done by men. They hunted animals and fished, but that didn't produce a lot, and it was a lot of work in order to get some food. Some scholars say between 20 and 40% of the food came from hunting. Most of the food actually came from gathering, which was typically done by women and children and things like that, where they gathered nuts and berries, fruits, roots, plants, whatever was in bloom when they came into a particular area. And that generally was most of the food. 60 to 80% of the caloric intake came from gathering, and then it was supplemented by hunting. All right. Now, there are still some groups that hunt and gather to this day, just not a lot of them. The groups who are hunters and gatherers today live in very, very isolated areas. Typically rural, very, very rural areas, but probably wouldn't even classify it as that, because they're nomadic, so it's very, very isolated areas though. Aborigine tribes in the Australian outback, probably a very good example. Okay, about 250,000 people, so we're talking about 250,000 people globally, and you can see as far as a percentage, it's a very, very small percentage. So it's very few people that are part of it. But there's this really interesting book where they went, this author went and lived with an Aborigine tribe in Australia for a while and kind of studied how they did things. It was really fascinating, because typically people think hunter-gatherers, very low level of development, but they knew a lot about their landscape and about the cycles of nature, because as they were nomadic, they would travel to an area right as things were coming into bloom. All right, they knew the migration patterns of animals, things that if we were forced to do, probably we would not do very well with. But these hunters and gatherers, they knew it, and they knew it well. And so it's just a different kind of knowledge and different kind of understanding. So again, we don't want to have this assumption that just because it's a low level of development, they don't know what they're doing. They know very well what they're doing. But it's just a different way of doing things, and not a lot of people are doing it anymore. Now, here's when the shift happens. This is when the change takes place. This is the first agricultural revolution, also known as the Neolithic Revolution. You have to know those two terms, all right, and that those two terms are used interchangeably. Here's the definition. First agricultural revolution dating back 10,000 years. The first agricultural revolution achieved plant domestication and animal domestication. And this was also known as the Neolithic Revolution. Now, in that definition, you have two other words that are used that we have to define, and that is domestication. That is the term that you need to associate with the first agricultural revolution, is domestication. Domestication of plants and animals. So what does domestication mean? That is the successful transformation of plant or animal species from a wild state to a condition of dependency on human management, usually with distinct physical change from wild forebears. And we're going to look at those physical changes here in just a couple minutes, what happened to plants and animals after we domesticated them. But that's what you need to associate with the first agricultural revolution, is domestication. That was the difference. We had hunted and gathered, but then the shift takes place with plant and animal domestication, where no longer are they wild, they are domesticated. They are dependent on us. So let's take a look at how that might have happened. So we start out with a couple theories. A name that without a doubt you absolutely need to know associated with agricultural theory is his name, Carl Sauer. Carl Sauer has this theory about the origins of agriculture. And Carl Sauer said that the domestication of plants and animals was not in response to hunger. It wasn't out of necessity. You didn't have to do it. It happened. Okay? Now, how might that happen? Well, Carl Sauer said that it wasn't amongst nomadic hunter-gatherers. They were hunter-gatherers, but they weren't nomadic. You're like, wait, how did they have enough stuff if they weren't moving around? Because that's the reason they moved around, is to make sure that they had enough stuff. Okay? Carl Sauer said that the reason they weren't moving around, okay, is because they were living in lands of plenty. Lands with high biodiversity, meaning that they didn't have to work very hard in order to get the food that they needed for that day. They didn't have to go very far. They didn't have to work extremely hard, which means that you had more downtime. And when Carl Sauer said you have downtime, you're then able to experiment with plant domestication. You're able to interact with some of this stuff and say, wow, that's interesting. I didn't know I could do that. And because of that, we saw plant and animal domestication happen a little bit earlier. Now, Sauer also argues that it begins with root cropping, called vegetative planting. Now, root cropping, as we'll talk about on the next slide, is the cultivation of roots. All right, great example of that is potatoes. All right, but Sauer argued because you're cultivating roots, that happens a little bit earlier. It's not quite as difficult. Happens in lands of plenty. Weren't nomadic. Therefore, Sauer argues, hey, that one of the herds, or the earliest herd, was in Southeast Asia about 14,000 years ago. So Sauer argues that plant domestication happens much earlier, 14,000 years ago, against what we're going to see here in a moment. Okay. Now, the other perspective on this is that instead of this happening in lands of plenty, it was that gatherers noticed that certain plants behaved in certain ways. That, they came through this area a year ago, now they're coming back through it again, and oh, look, we stayed here last year, and right where we left all of these leftovers that we had, now plants are growing. I wonder if we try that again. So there is an argument here that gatherers might have done this accidentally, that this might have happened accidentally, and then because they notice it, they start to then actively care for plants, creating leading to plant domestication. All right, and so instead of root cropping, which is typically associated with Sauer, there is this perspective on seed cropping. All right, the cultivation of seeds, which requires a lot more work and care, and thus the argument is that it takes place much later, typically in river valleys. And so one argument on both sides is that there were multiple independent herds. Sauer argues that maybe Southeast Asia was the earliest of these herds, but that there were multiple independent herds. Areas around the Tigris and Euphrates River, the Nile River, the Indus River, rivers in China, highland areas in Mexico and Peru. So in these areas, there's multiple independent herds. And because seed cropping requires more care and thus would take longer for people to learn on their own, without being taught it, learning on their own, the argument is that these independent herds emerged about 10,000 years ago. So there's a difference in time frame. Sauer argues about 14,000 years ago, the first being Southeast Asia, and then multiple independent herds after that. And then the other perspective is, maybe 10,000 years ago, and independent herds, but maybe like the Fertile Crescent being one of the first. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So we mentioned root cropping and seed cropping. So let's talk a little bit about plant domestication and take a look at this. Again, root cropping, also known as vegetative planting, the argument is that it happened earlier because it wasn't as, I don't want to say sophisticated, but it didn't require as much work on behalf of the people caring for the plants, because the crops grew underneath the ground, and so the people cultivating them, the people caring for them, basically cultivated the roots. It wasn't growing up and required additional work above the soil. And a great example again of root cropping or vegetative planting is potatoes. All right, or yams, taro. I mean, there's lots of different examples of it, and you can see areas in Southeast Asia, Africa, South America. Basically, the one area that isn't associated with root cropping was Southwest Asia, the Fertile Crescent, which is really associated with seed cropping. And so that's root cropping. And again, Sauer said that's where plant domestication takes place first, and thus happened earlier. His argument, Southeast Asia 14,000 years ago, the first of many independent herds. Seed cropping, on the other side, is a little bit more complex because you're cultivating seeds that ultimately have to grow into a plant. And so you have to select the seed first off. Hey, then you have to plant it at the right time. You have to water it. You have to harvest it at the right time. So there's a lot more that might go into it than, say, root cropping, which then explains the difference in timetables. 14,000 years ago on the root cropping side, whereas 10,000 years ago on the seed cropping side. And again, especially associated with Southwest Asia, where really the crops that are largely associated with the Fertile Crescent, Anatolia, around there, were things like wheat, barley, oats, rye, different grains, which are seeds, which are cultivated from seeds. Okay, so those are the two major sides on that. Now, what about animal domestication? Okay, we're going to focus mainly on Southwest Asia because some of the oldest cases that of animal domestication are associated with Southwest Asia. All right, whether those were goats in the Zagros Mountains, what is now modern-day Iran, about 10,000 years ago. Sheep in Anatolia, what is now modern-day Turkey, 9,000-ish years ago, 9,500 years ago. And then later, pigs, cattle, and dogs. But there is some discrepancy about dogs because did it happen even earlier? Some will argue that it happened for dogs. Animal domestication happened earlier because dogs then became dependent on humans. They followed hunter-gatherers, eating off of scraps, and then became dependent on them. So there is some discrepancy about some of these timetables because it's happening before recorded history. But what are some of the reasons why animal domestication might have taken place? Might have happened for ceremonies, pets, scavengers. We mentioned dogs there a minute ago. As beasts of burden for laborers. I want you to remember this term, beasts of burden, to help us with the work. All right, and a great example of an area that really kind of lacks beasts of burden were the Americas. The Americas didn't really have a lot of animals to really help with labor. The largest domesticated animal in the Americas was the llama, and it wasn't really great for work. All right, but horses, cows, significantly stronger than humans, and could help with some of the work. And then in addition to that, obviously the things like food and milk are really big reasons as to why certain animals were domesticated and became dependent on humans. Now, we mentioned before that animal domestication, or well, domestication just in general, is when plants and animals become dependent on humans, resulting in physical changes. So let's take a look at some of those physical changes. Here are some of the changes that happened as these plants and animals became dependent on humans, as they were domesticated. So the one thing I'd like you to kind of listen for, okay? Maybe you want to shorten some of these phrases down. Maybe you have questions. Questions are always a great thing to include in your notes. Observations, examples, all of these different types of things are great examples of things to include in your notes as we run through these. So on the plant side, because people are choosing seeds, one of the things that they're going to are going to be affected is how those seeds work with the plant. Like, for example, people are going to choose seeds that produce the biggest food or the biggest fruit. They're going to choose seeds that don't taste bad. Like, if you bite into something and it tastes really bitter, it's not very good, you're like, oh no, we don't want these seeds. But you bite into something that tastes really, really good, you're like, oh, let's hang on to these seeds. You're making choices, and that then affects what happens with those plants over time. And so you're also going to see things like the seed dispersal mechanisms changing, because they don't have to disperse themselves. They don't have to disperse themselves to regenerate, all right, to reproduce, all right? We are doing that for them. We are actively trying to do that for them. And so that's going to have a big impact on this. All right, as well as the loss of anti-predator mechanisms, because we are caring for them. They don't have to defend themselves anymore. So things like thorns, if we're choosing plants, the one that sticks us a bunch of times, we're not going to choose that one. But then we might choose the one that has fewer thorns, and then fewer, and then fewer, and then fewer. And over time, that's going to change the genetic makeup of these plants as well as animals. Speaking of animals, on the other side, obviously the growth rate is going to change, which then obviously affects the overall structure of these animals' bodies. Some archaeologists have actually looked at the bones of animals and compared the wild versus domesticated versions of these, and the bone structure has actually changed for domesticated animals. And again, we're making choices. Animals, if we are eating them and they're really, really tough, they're really muscly, that's not something that we're going to choose to reproduce. But if we can fatten them up, that's something where we're going to try and reproduce that. Okay? There's only certain animals that are tolerant to captivity. And so over time, we're also going to see changes in behavior. Think of wild dogs versus domesticated dogs, right? Your little chihuahua versus the wild wolf, I guess. Okay? We're seeing a difference in behavior, and that behavior is a product of thousands of years of dependency on humans and how that has changed these animals. Which then changes the social hierarchy, because some animals that might have died before on their own, we now protect. We now keep protected. And so that then changes this hierarchy in the animal kingdom. And so this is a really interesting effect of just animals and plants becoming dependent on us. So let's take a look at a couple images to wrap up this lecture for tonight. First thing that we're looking at on here is the independent herds of agriculture. All right, now specifically, these are seed herds. So the time frame is happening a little bit different than maybe what Carl Sauer argued, okay? But this is looking at plant domestication around the world. So you can see multiple independent herds, in northern China, in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, what we call the Fertile Crescent, in East Africa, in Mesoamerica, as well as sometimes you'll see Mesoamerica and Andean America separated, so like Mexico and Peru separated as separate herds. Now, the one big thing I want you to keep in mind from this image is these are also some of the same independent herds that we said were the herds of culture. So here's my big question to you, and this is a big question that arches over the entire class that we teach, is why did agriculture and culture begin in the same places? Because generally they did. All right, there's some exceptions and things like that. But why did culture and agriculture begin in the same spots? And what we're going to see later is that cities began in these same spots as well. So why did agriculture and culture and cities all emerge at the same time in the same spots? What's the connection that you can make? That's my big question to you guys. And we're going to talk about that in class, but I want you to start thinking about that, brainstorming on that, because that's a big connection. This next image looks at when different animals were domesticated and where they were domesticated and things like that. We mentioned Southwest Asia as an area where multiple animals were domesticated. Pigs, goats, sheep, cattle, dogs, all in Southwest Asia. And then you can see some other areas as well where different animals were domesticated. And as well, at different periods of time. All right, because again, these are independent herds. So different people and different cultures are stumbling on this at different times or experimenting with this at different times. So that impacts that as well. Take a look at these animals and go back to what we talked about. Think of ceremonies that might have been associated with these animals. Think of work that these animals could have done. We talked about dogs. In this case, this graphic says that dogs were the first domesticated animal. And again, why was that? We mentioned that the theory was that dogs were scavengers and followed hunter-gatherers around, became dependent on them, thus being domesticated a little bit earlier. This image is looking at one area called the Fertile Crescent, and a lot of times students have maybe heard this before but haven't seen the map that corresponds with it. So this is the area known as the Fertile Crescent. You can notice the two rivers that run in the middle here. We mentioned that seed cropping is especially associated with river valleys. And so in this case, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what are now modern day Iraq and Syria. And sometimes the Fertile Crescent is given as the one hearth of agriculture, but as we've discussed tonight, we see that generally it's accepted that there were multiple independent herds, meaning that it didn't diffuse to those areas, but that it started there independently. People came across this information on their own, at their own time, in their own ways, and then it diffused from there. And so generally it's associated that, or it's believed that, for example, that the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, with its city-states that you see there, domesticated plants and animals independently, 10,000 years ago, all right? And that the concept of agriculture, plant and animal domestication, diffused to Europe from the Middle East. And that fits with an argument that we made a couple of months ago when we talked about language. Remember, one of the theories behind the diffusion of Indo-European language was the Renfrew hypothesis, that it started in an Anatolian area and diffused with agricultural technology. Well, that fits with what we're seeing here, and the concept that agriculture and plant and animal domestication diffused to Europe from this area in the Middle East. Final thing that we want to talk about tonight before we get into the second agricultural revolution next lecture is the Columbian Exchange. Now, the Columbian Exchange takes place between the New World and the Old after Columbus comes to America. So 1492, the exchange that takes place after Columbus, so Columbian Exchange. And really what this is looking at, this is a great example of relocation diffusion. New plants and animals are emerging in different places. Okay? And the one that I always like to draw your attention to is notice that potatoes came to Europe, Africa, and Asia from the Americas. So, does the Irish potato famine happen without the Columbian Exchange? That's just one minor example that fits with a lot of the different things that happen as a result of the relocation diffusion from the Columbian Exchange. All right, these new plants and animals in new places. But notice there also that to the New World, many diseases came as well. But it's also important to understand that different cultures in the Columbian Exchange impacted a lot of cultures in these areas as well. So with that, I leave you guys tonight. The next lecture, we're going to look at the second and third agricultural revolutions. I'll see you in class. Have a good night.